So what's addiction? Addiction is characterised by three things. Binging on the substance to produce a euphoric effect. So euphoria, lift of mood, feeling good. And it's thought that from binging on the substance, the person develops a tolerance, so they need more and more of it, so they end up over-consuming the substance. The other characteristic is that they develop withdrawal effects. When you take away the substance, they will develop withdrawal effects so that they get a negative affect, they feel really unwell. And then the other criteria for addiction is that the person has a preoccupation with the substance so that they are craving the substance. And the term addiction is often used synonymously with dependence. So that dependence is compulsive and sometimes uncontrollable behaviour occurring at the expense of other activities. So other activities might be work or social relationships or physical and mental health. So substances of abuse activate release of dopamine in a part of the brain called the nucleus accumbens, which produces euphoric effects. And the circuitry, there's no actual evidence that there's a addictive personality. It's actually more biological. My next slide, I'm actually going to explain how that all works. And so I'll talk about dopamine and the implications for food addiction. Dopamine is a neurotransmitter, and it's involved in a whole variety of functions, including learning, memory, motivation, fine motor control, pleasure, and neuroendocrine signalling. What that means is communication between the nervous system and the endocrine system, which is all the glands that release hormones. So dopamine is the primary neurotransmitter involved in the mesolimbic reward pathway in the brain. What does that all mean? See that little picture of the brain there? That the red part is the reward system. Dopamine activates that part of the brain, which gives us a sense of pleasure and reward. And dopamine, there are lots of receptors, dopamine receptors throughout the brain, but the ones that we're interested in for the purposes of this talk are D1 and D2 receptors, and they're involved in rewarding and reinforcing natural behaviours, so we repeat and perpetuate them. And so that's thought that we have that system in place so that we will repeat behaviours that perpetuate the species, like sex and feeding, because if we didn't have that reward system in place in our brain, we would have died out eons ago. So dopamine is typically released the first time a person eats a novel or a new food. Dopamine's involved in learning, and so it's thought that the reason that occurs is because we want to focus on that food so that we learn from that experience whether that food is safe to eat or not. And then every time the person eats that food, the release of dopamine diminishes, so that over time that food is encoded in their brain as safe. And so drugs of abuse, though, release dopamine from the nucleus accumbens every time they're consumed, and they activate the reward pathway every time they're consumed. But as I previously said, drugs of abuse develop a tolerance, so the person needs to use more and more of them. So the circuitry is actually in place for food addiction.